Hey YouTube, doing a video on the Mafell KSS80Ec. This is a newer track saw from Mafell. It's their largest in the KSS series. It's actually identical to the K85, which is also a new saw from Mafell. The only difference between the two saws, in fact, is that this one has a base that allows it to attach to a KSS cross-cutting rail. Now this rail is unique to this saw, so it's not interchangeable with the other KSS saws. And the reason for that is it's a much larger saw and the saw base is quite a bit bigger, so they had to make the rail quite a bit larger as well. Saw on this side of it, you can see it's got a pretty open blade housing. When compared to other track saws like Mafell's MT55 for instance, or Festool's TS75 and TS55s. The dust extraction on this though is remarkably good. I would say fine dust capture is as good as my TS75, but you do get some of the larger pieces, some larger chips that don't get collected as well. So it does leave a little more of a mess behind than the TS did. But you don't have the fine dust that's airborne. Now on this side of the saw you can see there's a blade guard here. This is spring-loaded and it is retractable, both of course by pushing the saw into the material that you're going to be cutting, or by use of a lever on the other side of the saw. You have a spring-loaded riving knife. You can see here, this will actually push up and out of the way as you plunge into material, and then as you push the saw forward, that will drop back down into the material. Now the saw blade on here, the one I have is a 56 tooth. It is an aftermarket, or not an aftermarket, it's an add-on blade from Mafell that I purchased. The saw comes shipped with a 12 tooth ripping blade. There's 3 blades available for the KSS80. All of them use a 2.5mm kerf, and they all use a 30mm arbor. So because of the arbor, you can actually use TS75 blades in this if you needed or wanted to, and you just won't have as much cutting capacity with the saw. Now, speaking of cutting capacity, it says KSS80, but you can actually cut on a guide rail up to 82mm. So that's your cutting capacity on the rail. Off the rail, you can go to 88mm. This saw can be used on their F guides, so on their normal F-series guide rails as well as this KSS rail. Now the KSS rail is attached, so the design, at least idea behind this, was that you could take and bring the saw with you and make precision crosscuts with it, with this one system, without having to drag a separate rail around and get it all aligned separately. The saw can be removed from this rail, and all you have to do is push forward slightly, push in on a lever on the back side of the guide rail, and that allows it to slide off of the rail. Now just to show you the rail itself, it's pretty wide. It's about twice as wide as an F guide, Mafell standard F guides. The saw of course only rides between this profile and the splinter guard. The remaining portion of it's used for this spring mechanism that draws the saw back into the start position, and then there's also room here for the angle guide. Now because you've got quite a bit of room here, it actually makes for a really good place to be able to put your palm against, so you can provide nice firm pressure planting the guide rail very securely and flat to the workpiece you're cutting. You have 2 stops on this. I'll flip it around in a second and show you that. You have a fixed stop on one side, and that's here, and it is a precision fixed stop. If you loosen this up and retighten it again, it draws right back into the same position. You can't, in fact, you can't even intentionally move it out of alignment. It'll just take and draw back in because it's keyed into a precision hole. This side is your non-fixed, so this is what you're going to use to set your angle that you want to cut. To adjust the angle of cut on this, you actually loosen this knob up. So you just take and twist to loosen, and then you would take and adjust to your cutting angle that you want. So if I wanted to cut 35 degrees, for instance, I could go 35 in either direction, and the scale is quite large, so you can set an angle very precisely, and it's very easy to do so. So I could set it to 35, you just tighten it down, and now when you push this into your workpiece, I usually push it in until the fixed stop makes contact first, and then I'll pivot it until it hits the movable stop on this side. You wind up pushing in with the rail with your hip on this flat spot on the back side of the rail, so you get really firm pressure against the workpiece, and the resulting cuts have been spot on. Now there are some detents. You actually have, there's 6 detents on this. So you have one at 0 degrees, so that would cut at 90 degrees to your workpiece. The detents are precise. There's absolutely no play. If you push in on this pin to kind of lock it into the detent, you cannot move that stop forward and back. It is fixed at 0 degrees. So I just take and push in, and then you take and tighten the thumb screw, and you're locked on it at 0. Now you have a stop at 22.5 each way, a stop at 45 each direction, and then on this end you have an additional stop at 60 degrees. Now it says 370. The rail is actually, or the cutting portion of the rail is actually longer than 370 millimeters. 370 is referring to what the saw could cut at full depth. If you're cutting 3/4 inch material or 1 inch material, you'll get more than 370 millimeters of cutting capacity out of this guide rail. So that's it. The guide rail itself is very light, and again, very easy to use, very quick to set up. If you want to take in, you saw how easy it was to detach the saw. Attaching the saw to the guide rail is just as easy. All I do is take and line up one of the slots on the saw, and there it is. It's attached. The KSS80 does use 12 gauge cable out of the saw, so quite a bit beefier than the typical track saws. My TS75 I think used 16 gauge in comparison. The motor on this is 2300 watts, so it's just, I think it's just over 19 amps. So it does ship with, it actually ships with a 20 amp plug on it. And but the tool can be used on a 15 amp circuit if you're not cutting really thick material. It's going to basically draw the amount of current that it needs based on the thickness and density of the material you're cutting. The motor does have some speed adjustment to it. So you have a dial here that goes from 1 to 6, and that'll allow you to adjust the speed. It does have speed monitoring electronics in it, so it will actually maintain cutting speed throughout the cut. I don't know what each of the speed settings is for each of those numbers. It's in the owner's manual. I do know the maximum cutting speed on this is 4,400 RPM, so that's quite a bit faster again than my TS75, and that was 3550. On this end, I'll just kind of go through all the stuff that you see here. You have a really big knob, and this actually allows you to put, again, a really good amount of force with your palm right on the saw in order to keep it perfectly flat. So when you're cutting with an F-guide and you're doing a bevel, for instance, and you have some of the saw weight over on the offcut side of the rail, this really helps keep the saw planted firmly. I haven't had any issue with the saw wanting to tip. Just really good ergonomics. Now you've got a lever here that's tied to a stainless steel cable, and that's tied to the spring-loaded blade guard. So if you need to move the blade guard out of the way, all you have to do is push forward on this, and that'll bring the blade guard out of the way. And I'll flip it around towards the end of the video and show you that in action. You've got a bevel adjust here, and this allows you to adjust bevel from 0 to 60 degrees, and it's very precise and very easy to set. There are 2 locking points on this when you bevel, but there's only one lever to adjust, and it's right up here on the front. So again, all the controls are just up front. You need to make a bevel adjustment. All you do is loosen the bevel adjust lever. That loosens up the point on the back side of the saw as well, and now you can take and set your bevel adjustment. And then just take and lock it in place when you're done. You've got your plunge depth scales here. You have, it says KSS on this inside scale, and then there's nothing on the outside scale. So the outside scale is going to be for cutting directly on material. So that reads from 0 to 88 degrees. The inside scale that says KSS means that's adjusted for the 6 millimeters you're losing on their guide rails. The adjustment on it's very easy. Not sure how to get this captured, but basically you have a button that you press on one side, and that unlocks the plunge mechanism, and now you can take and move the saw up or down to whatever your plunge depth is. Now, if you're used to Festools or even the way the MT55 from Mafell plunges, that's done on a rear pivot point. So what you do on that saw is, or those saws, is you set your plunge depth first with a stop, and then all you have to do is pivot and push the saw forward to the plunge depth. This is a two-handed affair. So you have your hand on the saw and the trigger, engaging the saw, and then lower the saw down to the plunge depth that you need. But there's basically a rod that's right here that you can use to preset a plunge depth. And I did this earlier and preset a plunge depth to 40 millimeters. So if I bring this down all the way until I hit that stop, it's a hard stop, I'm set at 40 millimeters exactly on the guide rail, or 46 off the guide rail. So the scale is really easy to read, particularly with this little red marking here on the lower side of the lever. So it's actually not hard to do even without setting a depth. But if you want to get exact, they do have a depth stop here. Now to set that, you use the blade change Allen wrench, and that's stowed on the back of the saw here. I'm going to bring it back up. Oops. So if I wanted to set a specific plunge depth, let's say I want to go to 60 millimeters, I would take and just bring the saw down to 60, release that button that locks the saw in at 60, and then all I have to do here is take and loosen this locking screw on that plunge rod. The rod drops, and then I just tighten that back up. Don't have to get carried away, just snug it. And now I've got plunge stop set at 60 millimeters. So if you don't want to use the plunge stop, I'll just take and loosen it up, push it out of the way, kind of in the park position. It won't let you push it out of the saw, so you can't, you don't have to worry about losing it. Just push it up and to the point where it stops, and tighten that down. Now you have 4 of these knobs. There's 2 on the back here, 2 on the front, and that's actually for their parallel edge guide. And they have 2 different parallel edge guides that you can get with this saw. One is shipped with the saw, and that's what I'll call their standard parallel edge guide. You have laser engraved markings. Now I know this probably won't show well in camera, but basically a laser engraved scale on here that indicates how much material you'll have after making the cut. And there are 2 scales, so if you slide it in this way, you read the scale on the front here, and that will indicate how much material is left between the saw blade and the parallel edge guide. If I flip it around and I'm using it to reference off the offcut side, that scale now reads differently and will let me know how much material I'll have between the offcut side of the blade and the parallel edge guide. And I found that it's dead on. So again, this is included with the saw. Now they have another one that has some rolled bars to it that allow you to extend the parallel edge guide underneath the base of the saw. The last couple of things I wanted to touch on, well, one is going to be blade change with this. Now I already have the wrench removed, They have a system very similar to Festool's Fast Fix. They don't call it that. In fact, I don't think they have a name for this blade change system. But all you do is you press a button here on the side of the saw. The lever pops up. Now you bring the lever up the rest of the way. And what that does is it disengages the trigger, so there's no way that you can turn the saw on. You won't get any power to the motor. And then it locks the blade in position, so the blade won't spin. And then it also, if you bring the blade guard back, will lock the blade guard in the open position as well. So now the blade's very easy to change. In fact, I find this to be way easier to change than on my TS75 because it's all open here, so there's no housing to interfere with anything. When you're done, all you do is you bring that lever forward, and what I'll typically do is, no good way to do this and not get in the way of things, is just keep my hand on that blade guard lever that's on the other side so that the blade guard doesn't slam forward. So I'll just push the blade change lever all the way down and bring the blade guard into the closed position. So again, I mentioned I'd show you how that manipulates the blade guard. And again, the ergonomics are fantastic. Everything is right there where your left hand would be. So the last thing I wanted to say was the dust extraction port on this fits both Festool hoses perfectly. So again, I was coming from a Festool ecosystem, I guess I'll call it. So I already had their 36mm and 27mm hoses. And I was concerned, I really didn't want to have to invest in a bunch of new hoses for the Mafell tools, but their dust ports fit the same. In fact, both their MT55 and this KSS have a raised lip around their dust port here. So I find that the 36mm hose from Festool, it slides over it very easily, but I find that that raised lip actually locks the hose on better than it did on just having the smooth sleeve on my TS75. Of course, the 27mm hose will fit right on the inside of this. So that's it for the overview on the saw, and thanks for watching.